Welcome to Reynolda Church. Wherever you are joining this day, whether it's online or one of our campuses, we are so glad that you made the choice to worship with us today. For all Christians at all times, this is our day. This is the most important moment in Christian history where we, the people of God, celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. And we are so thankful that you are with us today. If you're joining us online, please let us know that you're here. If you're joining us on one of our campuses, make sure you fill out the Connect card. The Connect card is the best way to let us know that you are here, how we can pray for you, how we can celebrate with you. If you'd like to fill out the paper card, you should have received one on your way into the worship space. Or if you'd like to fill it out online, you can scan the QR code that's right there on the back of the card and let us know. We are so thankful for the ways in which your generosity makes the ministry of Reynolda Church go forward. We are aware that your sacrificial giving is what makes this work possible. So we assure you that the ways that you give are not unnoticed. And we use that giving to make sure that the world knows more about Jesus' story and how much He loves them. We hope today that as you're joining us, you will find a new way to connect to God's people at Reynolda Church, whether it's a new way to serve or a new community group where you can do life with a group of people that are committed to reading the Bible and praying for each other and just enjoying each other's company. But mostly today, we want to invite you to one special event. Wherever you are, we want you to mark your calendars for Sunday, May the 7th. We believe that there are times in the life of the church where we want to set apart time to reflect on what God has done and anticipate with joy and with excitement what God's going to do. And on Sunday, May the 7th at 6:30 p.m. at our village campus, which is located in Winston-Salem across from the Reynolda Village, we hope you will join us. There'll be childcare, there'll be worship, there'll be times of prayer. But on that evening, on May the 7th at 6:30 p.m. at what we're calling One Great Night, come and hear about what God has done at Reynolda. Over 100 years of faithful ministry to the people of this region, and also begin to get a glimpse of the ways in which God is leading our elders and staff into a new season of greater influence. One Great Night, May the 7th, 6:30 p.m. at the Village campus. Please do everything you can do to make that a priority and join us that night. It's Easter Day. Reynolda Church, we are lifting our voices this very day with those around the globe who are telling one story to a world that's asking questions about what's wrong with this world, what is the solution? We're not going to tell them what the solution is. We're going to tell them who the solution is. We are glad you're here today to worship the risen Jesus. As we, the people of God, say, He is risen indeed. Welcome to worship this Easter day.
Happy Easter, everyone. Very special word of welcome to all of our campuses, anybody that's a guest with us. What a privilege and honor it is to share Easter with you, as well to everyone who's joining us online. Are you ready for some good news? God knows your name. I have a friend who was telling me recently about a dear woman who she had to be tested for the possibility of Alzheimer's. And so she went, and the doctor began to ask her a series of questions. Our family, we've been there all too often. My mother in law, for years and years of her dementia, my father in law, and of course, countless beloved parishioners over the years. So anybody that's walked this road knows that there's nothing easy about it, and there's nothing funny about it, but you do have to, from time to time, give yourself permission to laugh anyway. And so the doctor's asking her questions and said, "Ma'am," said, "can you tell me the city in which you live, the name of the city?" And she was just silent. And the doctor said, "Can you tell me what today's date is?" She was silent. Said, "Can you tell me what day of the week it is?" Once again, she couldn't answer. And then he said, "Can you tell me the name of the President of the United States?" And she piped right up and said, "Well, I can tell you I don't like him." I don't even know which presidency was, so I'm not being political and I'm not making fun, but isn't it something that there is a part of all of us that might have an easier time telling you whether we like somebody as opposed to actually knowing their name? What is it that's hard sometimes about remembering names, learning names, holding on to names? But boy, isn't there something that is entirely different in a relationship when you know someone's name? I was reflecting on the beautiful Easter narratives again, and it just kept catching my attention until finally I felt like the Spirit of God wanted us to pause here on this intriguing conversation between Jesus and Mary of Magdala. This unusual conversation that begins with Jesus. Clearly, he knows it's Mary, but he doesn't let on that he knows her initially and just says to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? What are you seeking?" And she assumes him to be the gardener. And then evidently she must be getting ready to turn to leave, because the text tells us that then Jesus called her by name Mary. And she turned around and she said, "Rabboni." She was awakened in the revelation of the resurrection of Jesus Christ by Jesus calling her by name. I want to talk for a few minutes about the God who knows your name. Mary of Magdala was associated sometimes with the stories in the gospel of the sinful woman that anointed Jesus' feet. Sometimes she's been referenced as a prostitute, and yet the scriptures don't really give us evidence of that. What we do know is that she had a season of her life, perhaps a long season, in which she was terribly demonically afflicted and oppressed. The account tells us that Jesus had delivered her of 7 demons. And whatever this means, it means that she was emotionally and spiritually oppressed in such a way that she would have been riddled with confusion and anxiety, and perhaps even isolated because of all of this. And Jesus of Nazareth had compassion upon her and healed her and set her free. And so Mary, who is from this prosperous town of Magdala, she loved Jesus. She loved Jesus with all her heart because he had set her free. And so she supported the ministry. She followed Jesus. She was an encouragement. She was one of the few who was at the cross. She loved Jesus. And it's the Sabbath day, and because they had not finished the process that they wanted to finish of taking care of Jesus's body because of Sabbath, she came early as she possibly could on that resurrection morning. She came because she brought more spices. She wanted to more properly, in Jewish custom, care for the remains of Jesus's body. She was surprised by an empty tomb, and she is weeping. She's weeping in a way that would be not like the soft little sobs we might think of in our culture at a funeral, but more like a Middle Eastern time of grieving, probably like a wailing. And she is so sad because now not only does she have the feeling of loss of Jesus, but now the loss of his remains, and she thinks someone's taken the body. And Jesus asks her these two questions: why are you weeping, and whom are you seeking? Questions to which Jesus surely already has the answer, but questions that are really poignant. Why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking? I think he still asks those questions. What is it that makes you hurt? How have you been hurt in life? What is it that you are grieving? Where is it that you've been broken? And then he asks, and what are you seeking? Because God cares about where you hurt, and he cares about your healing. What makes you weep? And what are you seeking? So Jesus asks questions that he already knows the answer. She supposes him to be the gardener. It's early in the morning. She thinks that perhaps the only one who would be there would be the gardener. Interestingly, some of the classic art, including a Rembrandt, they depict Jesus in the garden with a wide-brimmed hat and a shovel. I don't think it's because he actually physically looks like he's been doing some gardening, but I think it demonstrates just how far away Mary was, along with the other disciples, of actually thinking that Jesus was going to be raised from the dead. This is one of the things that's interesting, is that Jesus regularly said that he would suffer many things and die and would be raised, and yet they really didn't anticipate or see the resurrection, and so she was missing Jesus. It's really hard, by the way, to believe that, as some have supposed, that early Christians conspired, came up with a conspiracy to declare Jesus resurrected, but actually they had simply stolen the body, when the earliest Christians were, as we see revealed in the scripture, not even expecting the resurrection. They didn't have faith for it. And so this fundamental question then emerges and is going on in Mary's soul is, why is the tomb empty? I read not long ago, for some reason, every now and then I'll just do this. I read an atheist's blog, and the atheist was telling about his little girl that he decided, in order to be fair, he took her one Easter to church. And it so happened to be a service where they had one of these little children's sermons. The pastor called all the little children up front. And once they got up, the pastor said, "Where's Jesus?" And the atheist little girl just piped right up. And she said, "Jesus is dead." The pastor was taken aback. He said, "Well, yes, honey." He said, but he was resurrected. And, and true story, she just spoke out loud for the whole congregation to hear. And she said, "No, I'm pretty sure he's just dead." I don't know what strikes me, it's so funny. But the fact of the matter is that all of history hinges on this question. Why was that tomb empty? Either Jesus is dead or he's alive, and nobody was ever able to produce the dead body of Jesus to disprove Christianity. Very hard to believe that those early Christians would be willing to die for something they knew to be a lie. And so the real reason that Mary didn't recognize Jesus is because she had a form of implicit bias of her own, in which she assumes that dead people don't walk around gardens and talk to you. She thought he was dead. That's why she didn't recognize Jesus. It's a beautiful thing that Mary's the first one that gets to witness the resurrected Lord, because she lived in a culture that didn't value the sworn testimony of women. And what a beautiful gesture of Christ himself. let her be the first witness, the first one to see him resurrected. In the resurrected form, maybe he looks a little different. Maybe she's weeping. Maybe it's early in the morning, the sky is dim. But the real reason she doesn't recognize him is she did not expect to see the living Jesus. So note this: it is possible to be in the same garden with God and not know it. It's possible to be in a room with Jesus and not recognize him. So this odd conversation begins between the two of them. You ever have one of these odd conversations where maybe you're not sure who knows whose name? Happened to me this very week. I was in a public setting, number of people around me, and another friend, we were there, and a man that I did not recognize at all came up, just walked right up, and got really close to me, like he just made a beeline over to me, and got close. I mean, in fact, got a little too close. You know that when you get a little too close, he was a little too close, and he just walked up and he said, "Don't I recognize you too?" I don't know how to respond to that. I said, "Pardon me?" He said, "Don't I know you?" And I know that being a pastor, that oftentimes there may be times where I'm not recognizing somebody that maybe had recognized me, and I thought, well, maybe that's happening. I said, well, and he put his hand out to shake my hand, and I thought, what is going on here? Is he expecting a secret handshake from me right now? Like, what? How are we interacting? So finally, I just put my hand out. I said, well, I'm Alan, and then he looked again. And he said, on second thought, maybe you're not the two guys I was looking for. You have a good day. I have no idea what it was about. This conversation between Jesus and Mary was an odd one. I almost wonder if a part of Jesus was playful with this, because the conversation is such that Jesus starts with this phrase, "woman." He doesn't call her Mary right off. This phrase, "woman, why are you weeping? What are you seeking?" It's not a term. It's not a harsh term. But it's just not a personal term. And he starts with that. And she tells him, "I'm looking, for Jesus. If you've taken his body, please let me know, because I'd like to know. I want to show reverence and care for his body." And it's interesting. Jesus could have revealed himself in any number of ways, right? He could have said, "Don't you know me?" He could have looked for, come look closer, take a second look at me. He'll do that later with Thomas, right? He could have drawn near to her and said, "I want you to think really hard about who." Any number of ways that he might have called her into revelation of his resurrected life. But what he chose to do was to say, "Mary." He didn't say, "Mary, it's me, Jesus." He just said, "Mary." And it's a powerful moment. What a beautiful scene. Can you imagine it? Can you just imagine? Can you imagine the turn that takes place in Mary's soul when it moves from the grief of not only have they crucified my Jesus, but now they've stolen away his body, and I can't even care for the body, to pivot, to move in a moment from that to hearing her name spoken from the Savior's lips, as she had heard so many hundreds of times, that affection and love in his voice from the one who had set her free from 7 demons, the one who had saved her life, who had shown her unconditional divine love. She hears her name, Mary, and the text says she turned. Literally, this was the turning point of her life. And she says, "Rabboni." It's like rabbi, which means teacher, but it is in the Greek sometimes the form of the word you might use for a little child. But in this case, it's more of a term therefore of affection, like my precious teacher, my Jesus, my Rabboni. And all of her longings and all of her hopes are met in the hearing of her name. And all of her worries and fears and grief begins to melt away. It's powerful thought, but utterly true. If you were to hear Jesus call your name today, everything in your life would pivot. I think it says something about God, that this is the way that he revealed himself. Jesus revealed himself, the first person to see him after the resurrection. I think it says something about God. I think it says that he's a personal God. Isaiah 43:1, now says the Lord, he who created you, O Jacob, he who formed you, O Israel, fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You're mine. Perhaps you remember the words of Jesus in John 10 when he was talking about being a good shepherd, and he said, he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the gatekeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. He's not a distant deity who simply wants to be revered. He is personal. He knows you by name. It's mind-bending to think of it, but this is the way God relates to you. Not like a number of the 8 billion people on earth. 8 billion people. 8 billion. Let's say your job full-time was counting, and you did it 8 hours a day. If you were going to count to 8 billion, and it was your full-time job, 8 hours a day, it'd take you 761 years to count to 8 billion. That's a lot of people on this earth. And you could imagine that a big God and this big planet and this big cosmos would treat you like a number almost. But oh, he knows your name. You've probably had experiences to know the difference between the two. I was thinking of the contrast of two customer relations experiences that I've had in recent memory. Quite the difference. One, unfortunately, I had to go to the DMV office. You know, you can do a lot of this by mail, but this was something that had to be handled at actual DMV. And you go and you take a number. Get in line and take your number. And when it's your time, you get called out your number. If you are in an office that doesn't use the number system, then you just wait in line, and then your name is next, next, next. And then I was privileged to be recently at Disney World, and I had to go to guest relations. Something wrong with the tickets. And I went in, nice lady met me, took my name down, her little iPad, motioned over to have him be seated in this nice waiting area in a leather seat, waited for a little while. And then another woman came walking over towards me and looked at me and smiled and said, Alan? I said, well, yeah. Like, how does she know my name? And I realized that when I walked in, they would take your name and then they would record some notes about what you're wearing, what you look like. You know, Alan, young man, looks like he's been working out a lot, you know, something like that. And so she comes over. The difference between next or number and Alan. How do you view God? Have you thought that he might look on you just as one of the 8 billion? I think what this resurrection story tells us that the heart of God is, no, he knows you by name. The 2012 film adaptation of Les Miserables, starring Russell Crowe and as that legalistic law officer Javert, and Hugh Jackman as the ex-convict Jean Valjean. in a marvelous supporting role from Anne Hathaway. On the day of his release from prison, when Jean Valjean was released after his 19 years, one of the songs in this musical film adaptation is called Look Down. And part of the lyrics is Javert, the law officer, says, "Bring me prisoner 24601. Your time is up, your parole's begun." You know what that means. And Valjean says, "Yes, it means I'm free." And Javert says, "No, it means you get your yellow ticket of leave. You're a thief," referencing a little card he'd have to carry with him to show potential employers that he was a criminal. And Valjean says, "I know the meaning of those 19 years, a slave of the law." Javert says, 5 years for what you did, the rest because you tried to run. Yes, 24601. Valjean says, "My name is Jean Valjean." Javert says, "I'm Javert. Do not forget my name. Do not forget me, 24601. Is referencing this dichotomy between how the one who represented the law versus the one who had been punished by the law. The one says, "You remember my name, but I'm going to remember you by a number." There is something in hell that wants to dehumanize us, to ostracize us, and convince us that God couldn't love us. And that's why we need grace. The law says, I'm Javert, I'm the law, and you are merely an offender. And what grace says is, Mary, Jean Valjean, grace calls you by name. And so it says something about who God is, his nature, he's personal. It says something also about how God calls us, what it is that actually awakens us. Mary, Miriam, Jesus says. And when he does, there is revelation in her about Jesus. And this is something, if perhaps you are just exploring Christianity, you wonder, how do you even become a Christian or what happens? There is a part of this that is a beautiful miracle. It doesn't have to be lightning bolt. It can be very quiet, it can be very simple, but it still is a miracle wherein it's as though what you couldn't see before you suddenly see. And how that happens is a gift from God. And in this beautiful story, it happens by Jesus calling Mary by name. And God's always been like this. He doesn't save people by placing a heavy burden on them or demand. Instead, it's more like he calls them. Just like in Genesis 22, Abraham, Abraham. He called to him when Abraham had Isaac on the altar. Or in Exodus chapter 3, in the burning bush, and he says, Moses, Moses. Or like when he comes to Jacob in a night vision, Jacob, Jacob, I am the God of your father. Or like when people hadn't been hearing from God very much, and there was a young boy named Samuel, and God appears, the Lord called him. 1 Samuel 3:2, Samuel, Samuel. Or even when Saul of Tarsus, the Pharisee, who was the chief persecutor of Christians, was on his way to harm Christians in Damascus. And Jesus appeared and said, Saul, Saul, Acts 9, why are you persecuting me? There's a way in which God awakens us by calling our name, and it is sometimes thunderous, but I find that more times it's like Jesus in the garden with Mary. It is warm, it's compassionate, it's almost like a father waking up a child. Bennett, time to get up. It's like a wake up and an honor at the same time. Our daughter Abby, when she was in high school, competed in speech contests around the region and the nation. And the way that you would find out who'd won is they would start calling names. And they'd start maybe with who came in 10th, and then they'd call the name. And so all the people that were in that particular competition would be gathered to the side of the auditorium. And I can't tell you how many times Ann and I are just huddled there, just nervously, along with the students and along with other parents, just hoping to hear her name called. It's such an honor when Jesus called Mary's name, and it's so warm and it's so compassionate. So it says something about who God is. He's personal. It says something about the means, the power by which He awakens new life within you. His call does that. And then beautifully, I think this story of resurrection and this interesting conversation says something about what God wants from you. And it's almost unthinkable. It's so wonderful. It's almost unimaginable. Because what we see in Jesus calling Mary by name is a picture of what God always wants, and that is that He, the creator of the cosmos, wants to be known. In his beautiful classic book, Knowing God, J.I. Packer says, imagine that we are going to be introduced to someone whom we feel to be above us in rank or intellectual distinction or professional skill. The more conscious we are of our own inferiority, the more we shall feel that our part is simply to attend to this person respectfully and let him take the initiative. Think of meeting the Queen of England or the President of the United States. We'd like to get to know this exalted person, J.I. Packer writes, but we fully realize that this is a matter for him to decide, not us. If he confines himself to courteous formalities with us, then we may be disappointed, but we do not feel able to complain. After all, we had no claim on his friendship. But if instead he starts at once to take us into his confidence, then everything changes. If there is someone who is far higher than you in some respect, Packer's saying, that you might like to get to know, the only way you get to know that person is that they make the bridge. I think of all the people I wish I could know or could have known. Billy Graham is certainly on that list. I wish I could have known him. I wish I could have had a meal with him, but I was one step removed from Billy Graham in a lot of ways. Most notably, my wife's aunt and uncle. You hear us talk about Stanley and Joella. They were pastor to the Graham family for many years in Montreat. Uncle Stanley pastored them, baptized their children, and knew them well. And I also had a dear friend who served for a period of time as executive director of the Billy Graham Association. He knew Dr. Graham. I've got a Bible at my house signed personally by Billy Graham to Mama Bennett, Ann's grandmother, because when Uncle Stanley was a missionary in Brazil and Billy Graham went and did a crusade, he stopped by, he saw Stanley, and Stanley asked him to take a Bible to his mother, and he did, and he signed it to her, and now we've inherited it. I've studied Billy Graham. I've read autobiographies. I took courses in college when we studied Billy Graham. I've been in the room a number of times with Billy Graham because he did a series of meetings at Chapel Hill. I've been all around and know a lot about Billy Graham, but I didn't know Billy Graham. And honestly, there's only one real reason why I didn't meet Billy Graham. And it's not because he would have not been gracious to receive me, and not because he wouldn't have liked me, or it's not because any of that. It's because, quite frankly, there was no apparent need or desire for Billy Graham to want me to know him. He would have had to build that bridge, wouldn't he? I couldn't, even though I had some points of contact around him. I didn't have a bridge to him. God so loved the world that He made it possible for you to know Him. That's what the cross and the resurrection of Jesus are all about. We have a personal God who, though awesome, wants to know you and be known by you. And so He calls you by name, and He points to what Jesus did on the cross, where Jesus took your sin and mine and paid a penalty so that justice could be served, so that there be no more debt of sin over your life, and that then in the power of the resurrection and the power and the glory of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, he proved that he is Lord over death, Lord over evil, conquered it all, and he lives forever so that anyone who trusts in him also will live with him and have new life now. And he did this because he wants you to know him. And what he does to draw you to him is he calls you by name. I pray this Easter day, maybe even in this moment, maybe in a moment of worship, or maybe tonight as you close your eyes and pillow your head, you'll be listening. Because Jesus speaks just as tenderly to you as he did to Mary. Jesus still calls people by name. And that's the gospel.